So we all know the Xenomorph has always sat at the top of the food chain in the alien universe. Or at the very least, that's how it seemed. Because right from the very first film in 1979, the Nostromo's science officer Ash, which was played by Ian Holm, called it the perfect organism. And he wasn't just talking out of theory. Ash was a synthetic working for Weyland-Yutani, stationed on the ship during its doomed voyage when the crew stumbled onto a Xenomorph on Acheron. And needless to say, that encounter was so catastrophic, it destroyed the Nostromo and left only one human crew alive. So if anyone knew what they were dealing with, it was Ash. And his description has stuck ever since. Now let's come back to Alien Earth, because we're finally seeing something that changes that order, and that's the eye. Officially, it's called Trypanohyncha Ocellus, or T. Ocellus for short, but it's picked up so many nicknames along the way. Some people just call it the eye, others call it the eye monster. Even Noah Hawley himself has his own pet name for it. So I keep saying, whatever sticks for you, just go with that. But enough about what we call it, because that's not the part that matters right now. What matters is that this thing went on to do something no one thought was even possible. It went after the Xenomorph. Now, when most people hear about a fight between something as small as the eye and an apex predator like the Xenomorph, they'd probably assume the eye must have been backed into a corner, that maybe it was just reacting out of panic or fear, or it even had no other choice. But from what we saw play out on screen, that's not what happened. It wasn't reacting. It actually called for the Xeno, meaning this wasn't chance at all. The eye wanted that fight, and I think a lot of people brush that off way too lightly. But that's not a small feat. We're talking about going one-on-one with the Xenomorph and walking away from it. Now mind you, the Xeno ran away from this battle, but we'll get into that later on. So that alone should tell you this isn't just some random parasite. But before that epic fight with the Xeno, the eye infected Shmuel, and Shmuel was part of the engineers on the Maginot. The eye controlled his body like a puppet and launched straight at the alien. And of course, Shmuel's body was killed again. And I say again, because the real Shmuel, the man himself, was already gone the moment the eye burrowed into his socket and took control. So what was left wasn't really Shmuel anymore. It was just a shell the eye was driving around. But the eye didn't stop there. It can always jump ship at any time it wants, so it just ripped itself free from the corpse and hurled its own tiny body at the Xeno. You could see its tentacles latching, biting, and holding on. So for the first time in canon history, and I'm not counting the Alien versus Predator side stories, that technically doesn't count here. A Xenomorph didn't dominate a fight. In fact, it was fighting for its life, and you could see it struggling. It had to shake this thing off its face just to get a breather, and the minute it was able to shake it off, it ran off. I personally enjoyed that fight sequence, but I think it's much bigger than that. It rewrote the entire food chain, because up until this point, the rules were very simple. Humans run, the hybrids improvise, you have the synthetics who study, and then the Xenomorphs kill. But from what we saw, the eye didn't run, it didn't even hide, and it didn't wait either. It just challenged the apex predator of the galaxy and walked away alive. So think about what that means. If the eye can force the Xenomorph into retreat, then the perfect organism suddenly has competition. And I'm not even talking about strength per se. I think it's more about intent. We all know the Xenomorph operates on instinct, which they're very good at because they're brutal and efficient. But the eye, on the other hand, chooses. It decides when to abandon a host, when to leap, when to fight, and in this case, it chose to face the one thing nobody else would dare. And this is what makes the fight so unsettling, because it wasn't a fluke. The eye already had a host in Shmuel, and it could have kept to that, but it deliberately escalated. That suggests we're not dealing with an animal in the traditional sense. We're dealing with something closer to a strategist. And if that's true, then this wasn't just a one-off clash. I think it was a test, or even a probe, and of course a way of learning what it takes to match the Xenomorph blow for blow. Which is why I think, beyond the cool fight scenes and whatnot, this scene really matters. And I'm not sure if that was even Noah Hawley's intention, because it signals a shift in the entire Alien universe. Because for the first time in decades, the Xenomorph isn't the uncontested king of nightmares. Something smaller, stranger, and smarter has stepped into the ring, and it didn't back down. A thinker, or just a parasite? At first glance, the eye looks like any other textbook parasite. I mean, it latches on, burrows in, and takes control of a host. That alone is terrifying. But if that's all it was, it wouldn't stand out in a universe already crawling with things like facehuggers, chestbursters, and blood ticks. But I think the difference is that those creatures are driven by instinct. They're terrifying because they follow their biological programming with absolute efficiency. The eye, on the other hand, goes further. It doesn't just react. It'll thoroughly study, test, and then eventually decide. That's not just instinct. That's problem solving at near human intelligence. And the lab notes from the Maginot spelled it out plainly. Remarkable problem solving skills at near human measure. That's not a throwaway line. That's the kind of thing you expect to hear about an advanced AI or a hybrid like Wendy, not a slimy alien that looks like it belongs in a jar. And yet, we've already seen multiple instances of that intelligence in action. Take its escape from containment as an example. Most parasites just wait for opportunity. The eye created one. It studied the glass tube it was in. It tested the boundaries and looked for weak points. So when Chibuzo failed to secure the case properly, the eye exploited it. It wrapped its tentacles around the inside of the glass, braced its body, and pushed until the container toppled. That's clearly not instinct. That's pure calculation. A predator that evaluates its environment and makes a move. And another thing I found interesting was it waited until no one was around, which means it wasn't just strong enough to get out. It was smart enough to time its escape. And then of course there's the sheep test. On the surface, it looks like another grotesque experiment, which it kinda is, especially for that poor sheep. But the eye burrows into the sheep and turns it into a puppet. And then of course after that, we saw from the monitors that the sheep's brain activity spiked off the charts, producing high gamma waves. That's the kind of pattern you associate with cognition, problem solving, and maybe even creativity. And I think another interesting thing is that the eye wasn't just riding the sheep like a vehicle. It was syncing with the nervous system, amplifying it, and pushing the host to act in ways it normally couldn't, which is why right after it took over, it stood upright and started moving with uncanny purpose. That's not normal biology. That feels more like borrowed intelligence. And think about what that means. This thing doesn't just hijack bodies. It hijacks minds. It's not content with muscle and bone. It wants pathways, neurons, and problem-solving circuits. That's why scientists compared its intelligence to a human's. Because when it takes over, it's not just steering, it's learning. And every host, every test, and every fight is another lesson. Smarter than synthetics thought. So here's where things get a little bit unsettling. Because another thing I realized is that the eye doesn't always act like a parasite looking for the nearest warm body. Sometimes, it looks like it's choosing. Think back to its first big encounter with Nibs. At that point, the eye already had a host, which was the cat. But the second it saw Nibs and the other hybrids, it ditched the feline and went straight for her. That's not hunger, that's selection. And speaking of the eye using animals as hosts, I think this proves something important. Maybe it doesn't like being in animals. It wants humans, or at least human bodies. So just check out the pattern. When it was inside the cat, the moment it spotted Nibs, it jumped ship. When it took over the sheep, it stood up like a marionette, all stiff and awkward, until I'm guessing it realized that maybe it was in the wrong body. Another interesting thing is, when it was inside Shmuel, it didn't jump ship the way it did with the cat. Zaveri was right there, another viable human body, and yet it stayed put. I thought that was so interesting because it tells us this thing doesn't just want any host. It wants the right host. So maybe it just doesn't care for animals at all. Maybe it has a preference for humans. Or maybe Shmuel in particular offered something it didn't want to give up. Also, was it simply because he was human, and that was enough? Or was there something about Zaveri that made the eye hesitate? We don't know yet, and since we haven't seen it inhabit a lot of humans, there's still so much more to learn about the eye. But it definitely raises the question of whether this creature is picky about who it chooses to control. Anyways, back to Nibs, because ever since that encounter, Nibs has been convinced she's somehow pregnant. Also, don't forget, she became physically violent with Sylvia when she kept pushing her to talk about what happened on the Maginot. Now, whether that's pure trauma or the first sign of some new kind of implantation, we don't know. But either way, it shows how the eye doesn't just leave behind physical damage. It leaves mental fractures, rewrites how people see themselves, maybe even plants ideas that weren't there before. So I guess for a creature this small, the ripple effect is pretty enormous. Now let's circle back quickly to the sheep's test, because we already know the eye wasn't just dragging the sheep around. It was boosting the host's brain, pulling more out of it than the animal could normally give, which means every time it takes a new host, it's not just using their body, it might be learning from their mind. That's what makes the Nibs incident so terrifying. Because if the eye is feeding on intelligence, then synthetics and hybrids aren't immune the way they are with xenomorphs. Facehuggers don't care about androids, but the eye doesn't need flesh and blood to gain power. All it needs is access, and whether it's the nervous systems, neural links, or synthetic brains. It don't matter because all of that is fair game, an anti-hero in the making. So here's the part that messes with your head. The eye isn't just a parasite or a predator. Sometimes it feels like an anti-hero. It's not a savior or a villain, but something in that messy in-between. And I think that's why people are drawn to it. Because being purely good is boring, right? Same with being purely bad. It's just one note and you always know what to expect. But when you're stuck in that messy in-between, unpredictable and hard to pin down, that's when you actually intrigue people. Take the moment in the lab with Shibuzo and the blood ticks, for instance. A tick slipped out of its container, crawled toward her thermos to lay its eggs. Immediately the blood tick got out. The eye started banging on its glass, tentacles tapping like it was sending a signal. Now, was that a warning to get her attention? Or was it a distraction so she'd slip up, giving the tick its chance? I guess we'll find out soon enough, but the fact we even have to ask says a lot, because either way, it changed her fate. Let's also take a look at what happened with Zaveri and Shmuel. We've already covered why the eye didn't go inside her, but that's not the point here. What stands out is how it handled her. She was completely vulnerable, and yet it didn't finish her off. It just knocked her out and left her lying there. And that choice says a lot. And remember when it came face to face with Morrow? It didn't attack him. Some people might say that's just because he had a gun, but come on. If this thing can go toe-to-toe with a Xenomorph, Morrow wouldn't have been a problem. So that choice feels deliberate, and it fits into why I keep saying the eye is less monster and more anti-hero. Now that doesn't make the eye merciful. Don't get me wrong, it's not sparing people out of kindness. The eye has no sympathy, but these moments show it doesn't move with blind instinct. It chooses, and sometimes those choices happen to benefit the humans around it. Why the Xenomorph might fear it. The Xenomorph has always been the gold standard of fear in this franchise. I mean, this organism has acid blood. They have the strength, speed, and relentless instinct. So it's understandable why it's been untouchable for decades. But in Alien Earth, for the first time, that dominance gets challenged. And not by humans, but by something the size of a fist. Most creatures would bolt at the sight of a Xeno, but the eye treated it like prey. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some fans have pointed out a theory that maybe the Xenomorph's eyeless design is no accident. Because think about it, the eye survives by ripping out eyeballs and hijacking bodies through the socket. Xenos don't have eyes to scoop out. So is that an evolutionary defense? I was thinking maybe if both species share a home world, maybe the Xeno adapted over time to protect itself from predators like this, which would explain a lot. So the Xenos have acid blood as a deterrent and eyeless skulls as armor, not just against humans, but against its own natural rivals. Even then, the eyeball still held its own. It's smaller, quicker, more agile, and more importantly, it thinks. The Xeno's power comes from instinct and efficiency, but the eye fights like something with strategy. It clings, it evades, and it finds openings. That battle looked like two apex predators testing each other, and this was the first time we've seen a Xenomorph in canon fight something that wasn't just human fodder, and it didn't come out looking invincible. The eye forced it to work and retreat. So yeah, the Xeno might be the perfect killing machine, but the eye is something different. It's a rival and a competitor. And if you're the perfect organism and something else shows up that can hang with you in a fight and maybe even outthink you, then suddenly you're not so perfect anymore. What this means for Alien Earth. If the Xenomorph has always been the centerpiece of fear, the eye changes the whole picture. Because what Alien Earth has introduced isn't just another monster in the shadows, it's a rival, a wild card, and maybe, just maybe, a weapon humanity could use. It could even be a potential asset. Because look at what happened when it tapped on that glass while the blood tick was loose. Some viewers saw it as a warning. Others saw it as a distraction. Either way, humans walked away alive. The same thing when it threw itself at the Xenomorph. Its motives weren't noble, but the outcome? Morrow and Zaveri got to live another day. Well, I guess with Zaveri a few more minutes. But that's what makes the eye so unsettling. Its goals and ours can overlap, but only by accident. And that means it's unpredictable. You can't reason or make a deal with it. At best, you can benefit from its war with the Xenomorphs. At worst, you're next on the list once it's finished with them. And I think they might actually surpass even the facehugger as the scariest parasite in the franchise. Which is saying a lot. The facehugger was always the ultimate nightmare. A silent attacker that leaves you alive just long enough to become an unwilling incubator. But the eye doesn't just end your life. It takes it and wears you like a puppet, and that's a whole new category of horror. Also, the eye is more than just a shocking cameo. It's here to be a persistent force in this story. And Noah Hawley confirmed that in his interview. He said these new creatures, including the eye, aren't gimmicks. They weren't designed to disappear after one season. They're here to shake up the lore and to rewrite what we thought we knew about the Alien universe. And I really like that because that means Alien Earth isn't just recycling old scares. It's building something new. And if the eye really has the brains to go with its bite, then the Alien franchise may have finally found something even more terrifying than the perfect organism.